So our next speaker, Corinne Zupko, will be speaking on mindfulness, happiness, and health. Corinne is the author of the forthcoming book, From Anxiety to Love. She is an adjunct professor of counselor education at the College of New Jersey. She earned her master's degree in counseling from the College of New Jersey and her EDS degree in counseling with a concentration in meditation from Rider University. Corinne is a licensed professional counselor, a national certified counselor, and board certified coach. So please join me in welcoming Corinne Zupko.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really thrilled to be sharing a practice that has made a huge difference in my life. As Sarah said, I was diagnosed with my first anxiety disorder at a very young age. This is me back in the late 70s, maybe early 80s. And this is about the age when I was diagnosed with separation anxiety disorder from my mom. From there, I went on. College years are a time that we might know is when mental health issues surface for a lot of people. And that was when my anxiety issues sort of morphed into the next phase of being overwhelming and debilitating. And it's been through this practice of mindfulness, through developing my own spiritual practice, that the anxiety issues that I used to live with are light years from me. And so I'm really passionate about sharing this practice with you because this practice has huge implications, not only for you professionally in terms of doing your job and being present and being fully there, but personally in terms of your level of happiness, your level of satisfaction in life. I'll talk about some of the research relating to this. I did feel inspired to share a really quick story. I wasn't planning on sharing this, but Sarah mentioned that I'm coming out with my first book, which I actually just sold to a publisher on Monday. It'll be published a year from now. And oh, thank you so much, thank you. Really big moment for me because the book is about my recovery through practicing spiritual principles, through practicing mindfulness principles, and it's a self-help book to teach others to do the same. And I share a story in this book about nurses. And I have such a sense of gratitude for what you all do. The work that you do, I know, often perhaps goes underappreciated, especially from the patients that you work with, but the nurses that I've had a number of times when I've needed to go to a hospital or a medical facility for a procedure or surgery, and the nurses have made such a difference for me, particularly being on the edge of the anxiety, the higher end of the anxiety spectrum of really being fearful. The calmness, the peace, you not only heal people's bodies, but you heal people's minds whether or not you realize that. So I want to just share this really quick story. I had to get some extensive blood work, and one of my anxiety issues was phobias of needles and blood. So you can imagine this wasn't a pretty situation. And I was at a doctor's office. This nurse, I don't think was being very present. This is a lot of what we'll talk about with presence. And this nurse said to me, when I was telling her sort of why I was there and what was going on as she's taking vials and vials of blood, she goes, "Don't you pass out on me." So guess what I did? The words that we say to one another are really, really powerful. And especially when you're someone like me who's already really sensitive, words like that can make a big difference. So that doctor actually referred me here because I had to get some more extensive blood work. So not only was it hard for me to get blood drawn, to be in a hospital was even more triggering. And I was working my spiritual practice. I was trying to get in the moment as much as I could. I was still terrified. But the practice that I was engaged in was really having pure willingness. Rather than calling forth witnesses to my own fears, I wanted to call forth witnesses to love. And the nurse that drew my blood when I had to come here to get this test done ended up being the mom of a dear friend of mine. She had no idea the impact that she had on me that day of literally being an answer to my prayers. We went through the whole thing, no problem whatsoever. We talked about her daughter, her daughter's kids. It was an absolutely miraculous experience for me, all because I was willing to shift into some focusing on peace and love instead of my own fears. So I just really wanted to emphasize to you all that you heal more than you realize, and you have a bigger impact on patients than you realize. So thank you for the work that you do. I found when I was preparing for this presentation 903 peer-reviewed journal articles when I searched for nursing, burnout, and mindfulness. There's a big growing movement to show how much mindfulness can buffer us against the stresses of our jobs, against the stresses of life. Your ability to tune into yourself enhances your ability to tune in to be present to your patients, as well as reduce your own level of stress. And as I mentioned already, this has big implications for who we are as professionals, but even more importantly, who we are as people and how it is that we're living our life. I forget what year in the 1980s, there was a Time magazine cover, and the cover of this Time magazine said, 1980 whatever, the age of anxiety. We kind of have to laugh, right? With just all the more pressures, all the more stresses, the political climate, everything that we're dealing with in the world now, terrorism, health threats, anxiety has even ramped up even more. Jon KabatZinn, who is the author of a number of books and really the person who's responsible for bringing mindfulness into mainstream America, he says, one of his chapters is in this book called Coming to Our Senses. The chapter's name is ADD Nation. He says that as a people, we sort of collectively suffer from attention deficit because we're drawn in so many different directions all the time. And also, he has another chapter called 24/7 Connectivity, meaning that nowadays, because we have these wonderful gadgets called smartphones, we can be out in the middle of a campsite in the middle of the woods and still be plugged in to our phones. We can still be not present because we're doing something else. And I'm seeing some smiles of acknowledgement there. I've mentioned some of this already with just our political climate, the division that we see in our own culture amongst different people. And our symptoms on a large scale, many of our diseases today, as we know, are linked to lifestyle factors. They're linked to the stress levels that we have, the things that we're eating. Our symptoms on a small scale don't necessarily become apparent until we sit down and close our eyes and see how much our minds actually are all over the place. Buddhists call this monkey mind, where we literally jump from one thing to another to another. I'm seeing a lot of nods of agreement there too. So this is something that mindfulness meditation addresses. So what is mindfulness? I want to just define this before we start practicing and before we go further. There's not one universal definition of mindfulness. These are just a few different folks who've put it in a few different ways. We can think of mindfulness as paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, moment to moment, and non-judgmentally. So we're doing something in this practice that you all already know how to do. You know how to pay attention. This is just a skill that we can refine and hone and grow. And through that, again, science is showing these incredible health benefits for our bodies and our minds just by this simple act of paying attention and being present. Awareness of present experience with acceptance is another definition. Here, oftentimes, we might be aware of our present experience, but we don't like it. We want it to be something different. We want it to be something better. And so we don't accept, we don't acknowledge what our present experience is because we're too busy trying to get rid of it. How many of us often have the experience of driving from point A to point B and having no memory, no recollection of what happens in between? Almost everybody. I'm not immune from this myself, even though I practice this all the time. There was a time when I was teaching a class on mindfulness at the College of New Jersey. To get here, I have to get on 195, so there's that whole 295 or 95 to 295 to 195 thing that you have to take. And after this class, I got on my hands-free cell phone as I was driving home, and I was upset about something. So I was downloading to my husband in the car, just sharing. And I finally, after being fixated on the road and driving, I looked up and I saw a sign for Florence. I had driven on 295 South 10 miles past the exit for 195 to come home. So there is just another example of how we can go on automatic pilot. We do this all the time, and we lose touch with what's happening in the moment. So mindfulness is the opposite of this automatic pilot. Mindfulness is about knowing what we're doing while we're doing it, rather than being somewhere else in our heads while that experience is happening. So let's do a quick experiment. These are all experiments. As we practice these meditations, You're welcome to join me, or if you feel comfortable just sitting quietly, keeping your eyes open, you're welcome to do that too. You're completely in charge of your own practice. If you'd like to join me, I invite you to sit in a comfortable position, perhaps upright a little bit, both feet on the floor. And if you'd like to close your eyes, we're going to do a brief experiment. Try for the next few moments to not think of anything. Taking a breath and allowing our eyes to open. Was there anybody in the room that successfully thought of nothing? Beautiful, not one hand. Oh, did I see a hand? Yeah. Oh, okay, so one hand perhaps. The longer we go, however, the more likely it is that thoughts would arise. So it is a universal experience that we have thoughts that pop up into our mind all the time. This is very, very normal. In fact, this ability to think, this ability to plan, is why we've come to dominate the planet. We survived, our ancestors survived because they remembered the bad. They remembered to stay away from the cliff, Tyrannosaurus rex, the snake. They remembered these things. The folks back then with the anxiety disorders were the ones that protected the whole community. So we've survived obviously because of our ability to think and plan, also because we have an opposing thumb, little fact. We have the ability to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, worrying if we have enough money in the bank, and what are we going to do if this happens or that happens, and we turn on that same fight or flight response that a zebra experiences when they're being chased by a lion. So that's the downside. That's what doesn't work about our makeup, and this is where mindfulness can help. So the cost of this ability to think and plan is that it's been found, this is where happiness comes in. When we're wandering, when our mind is wandering, we tend to be less happy. They did a study where they gave, it was a huge N, it was a very big sample size. They gave these folks pagers, and at certain points, or smartphones, certain points throughout the day, these folks would get paged and they had to punch in what they were doing, whether or not they were present, and what their level of happiness was. And what this study found was that for folks who were present, even if they were doing something unpleasant, let's say taking out the garbage, even if they were doing something unpleasant, the folks who were present had a higher level of happiness than the folks who were on the beach but plugged into their smartphone, totally not there, not present. So this ability to be present has huge implications for our happiness. We live fuller lives, we connect more deeply with others when we're simply paying attention. We're not taught in schools. Our kids, we tell them, pay attention. We might even just say this as a parent, pay attention to me. We expect them to know what that means, but we don't actually teach them what paying attention means. And mindfulness answers this question through these practices that we'll do, where we learn how to bring our wandering attention back and back and back over to this present moment. And that literally changes the structure of the brain. So let's begin with our first experiment. We're going to practice a mindfulness of breathing exercise together. So again, I encourage you, it can be really helpful, especially if you're a little tired, to sit upright in your chair. So rather than lean back in your chair, which you're welcome to do, but you're welcome to also sit upright, imagining perhaps that your spine is nice and elongated. You can imagine a thread coming through the top of your head, elongating the spine. Sitting with both feet on the floor. And if you'd like, allowing your eyes to close. You're welcome if you need to experiment with allowing your eyes to open. It really doesn't matter. But if you'd like, allowing your eyes to close. And I'm going to ring my meditation bells 3 times to signal the beginning of our formal practice period, and I'll ring them 3 times when we're done. So bringing our attention to our own sense of breathing. Now, it can be helpful when we're starting this to place one hand on your chest, and you can do this with me if you'd like. Place one hand on your chest and the other hand on your belly. Now, we're not doing any kind of deep breathing. We're simply breathing naturally. And we can sense the breath through the hands, through the movement of the hands. And there'll be sounds around us, both near and far. We can just notice sounds if they arise, and we can just bring our attention back to this sense of breathing. Sensing the hands move as you bring air into your chest and lungs, and as that air exhales and leaves. As you breathe naturally, see if you can notice if one hand is doing more of the moving than the other. So maybe that top hand is doing most of the moving. And if you find that the top hand is doing most of the moving, seeing if you can soften your abdominal muscles. So there's a little more movement in the belly. Sensing this movement in the belly, and perhaps throughout the torso. This is our anchor. This movement from the breath is where we're going to bring our attention to each time we notice our attention wander. Even just by that simple act of softening the abdominal muscles, we might notice an increased sense of calm. And if you'd like, you're welcome to relax your hands onto your lap, or you can keep your hands where they are just to keep sensing the breath. And seeing if we can get really curious about this breath. This breath that's always here, it's always with us, and it's always in the present. It's never this breath later in the future or that breath before. There's only this breath. And so it becomes a beautiful anchor for us to pay attention to. And regardless of whatever thoughts arise in the mind or sounds around us, we might notice that our attention wanders. That's just what it does. That's completely normal. Our task is simply to notice when our attention wanders and choose to bring our attention back to this breath without judgment. We might have to bring our wandering attention back to this breath 100 times in a minute. And if that's the case, that's completely normal. It can be helpful to even label the breath. So experimenting with me, in your own mind, you might say inhale as you breathe in, and perhaps exhale as you breathe out. Sensing this breath in and this breath out. And maybe experimenting and seeing if you can notice that tiny moment when the in-breath becomes an out-breath. And that tiny moment when the out-breath becomes an in-breath. All the while, if we notice that we drift, choosing to come back to this breath without judgment for the wandering. It's almost like we're training a puppy, a high energy puppy, and we're nudging it back over and over. So this returning of our attention to the breath is done with kindness. Sensing this breath in and this breath out. When you're ready, if you haven't already done so, allowing your eyes to open. I'd love to hear from anyone who's willing to share what that experience was like, what you noticed. And I'm not looking for it to be good. It can have been a challenge. It can have been a struggle. That's where the learning happens, when we learn how to work with the challenges that we face in our practice. Any volunteers? Yes, thank you.
I get sleepy.
Uh-huh.
So I want to do more, but I always end up falling asleep.
So sleepiness. Sleepiness is definitely one of the challenges that shows up in this practice. I'm trying to remember the name of, it may have been the Dalai Lama. It was somebody well known in Buddhism who said, one of his students said, I keep falling asleep, and the response was, if you're tired, sleep, that we might be sleep deprived. So number one, that would be the first thing for us to consider, is that if we do have sleep deprivation, if we do need to catch up. But even if we are rested, we can still experience sleepiness in the practice. So there's ways to work with that. The ways would be, first off, we can start to bring awareness. What is the feeling of sleepiness like? How do I know I'm sleepy? What am I noticing about the sleepiness? And coming into awareness about the sleepiness can actually help bring us out of the sleepiness. Another option is to open our eyes, to do this practice while we have our eyes open. We can just gaze down at a point in front of us that feels comfortable. We can stand up. Standing meditation is considered another formal posture. It's not just sitting down. So there are ways of working with that sleepiness, and also finding a time of day that this might work for you. For some of us, we might really click with doing this in the morning. Others might perhaps be in the evening or some other time during the day. So finding a time perhaps when we feel most alert that this can be helpful. So thank you so much for sharing that. That's super common. Anyone else willing to share? Yes.
I feel like it's uncomfortable to sit in the same position.
Yes. Did anybody else experience discomfort from sitting in the same position? A number of us. Okay, I'm so glad you brought that up. Now, again, this type of meditation is not something that's very strict. So if we need to move or shift, we can move. But we have options in terms of how we'll do that. We can notice the discomfort, and we can either do what we usually do, which is have a knee-jerk reaction and fix whatever that discomfort is. We can notice the discomfort and mindfully shift, so bring awareness to the process of whatever it is that we might need to do to make that discomfort go away. Or the third option is to stay with the discomfort, to actually bring attention to the point that is uncomfortable, to the point that hurts. Because this practice isn't about having a blissful experience. We're not relaxing necessarily when we do this. We're building our ability to be more aware. And that means we're being more aware of what's even unpleasant in our life, that we can learn how to be with the unpleasant rather than try to push that away, because the thinking is that if we can learn to be with what's unpleasant as much as what's pleasant, we'll suffer less, because we're not trying to constantly push away part of our experience, which is always there. So those are just some ways that we might be able to work with that discomfort. And I do recognize you've probably been sitting in your chairs for quite a number of hours now. So thank you. Any other feedback or questions? Yes.
I have a question for mindfulness. It's living in the moment, but it seems to me that everybody's always looking forward to something, whether it's a vacation or a trip, because always the fantasy is better than the reality.
Absolutely.
So isn't that kind of a better mindset to think ahead all the time? And you know you're in the moment, kind of, sort of, but looking forward to things to keep us going.
So there's sort of two sides to that. There's definitely, this goal-oriented, we have things that we want to accomplish, things we want to do, things to look forward to that we get excited about, and there's nothing wrong with that. The risk is that we lose out living fully in the now. We risk losing out appreciating the small things that, we don't notice a flower, or we're not really tasting our food as we're eating it. And so you'll see in the research, it's showing that this ability to be with what's happening now, being fully present, is changing our brains, it's boosting our immune systems, it's having all these different effects on the body by being present. So there's nothing wrong with being excited about the future, but the risk that we run as human beings is that we spend all of our time looking forward and none of it being in the moment. So thank you for that comment.